Welcome to the Anarchist News Review from Freedom Press, freedompress.org.uk, freedomnews.org.uk. I'm Freedom Editor Uri Gordon, together with Simon from Freedom Press. And tonight we're going to cover a series of topics that are on the headlines right now. The ongoing genocide in Gaza and the current hearings in the International Court of Justice, the Amnesty International report, as well as direct actions here in Britain. We're looking at them along with the peace camp at Lakenheath that ended recently, and asking what can these actions still achieve, and where we might draw some sustenance from. We'll be looking also at some uh, expectations for what's ahead of us. Uh, the nicest thing that's probably ahead of us is a series of anarchist book fairs coming up in the months of the rest of the summer and autumn, winter. We've got a few listed there, and we're going to talk about what to expect, and then we'll move to some British politics, as well as the anticipation of again a labor clash over public sector pay, with the government again playing hardball, and strike action or other kind of stoppages being threatened currently by unions, both in the NHS and other sectors. Um, and finally, we'll anticipate, the local elections in the UK that are coming up. To a degree, they're a weather vane. It kind of depends how widely or narrowly you're looking at things. But we'll take a look into that murky crystal ball towards the end of the show. Um, so let's move to talk about the situation in Gaza, as well as in The Hague and in the UK. The complete blockade on humanitarian aid imposed by Israel on the Gaza Strip has entered its 60th day, and there are grave and urgent warnings about famine, about hunger setting in. The World Food Program has declared that its reserves have run out. There are still remaining reserves. There are some signs that countries are beginning to step in order to pressure Israel to remove that blockade, including some forces within the American administration who understand the gravity of the situation. But at this point, it's really reached that horrific situation where we see everything. We can't say we didn't know, but the powerlessness that uh, those few who are confronting that horror, you feel utterly powerless to stop this horror from going on. And yeah, I mean, so there is the Court of Justice, there is the Amnesty report. I mean, who's even listening to it anymore, right? I mean, Israel is just being allowed to proceed with the second and more major stage, actually, of the genocide in terms of numbers of people killed. Like, we're talking about assessments of from the Gaza government and Ministry of Health, of about 60,000, 61,000, including people thought to still be unrecovered bodies under rubble and so on. But if we're getting into a stage of famine and disease, then if this isn't stopped, then it could get to the hundreds of thousands. And this is something that is really reaching, Holocaust dimensions, for people who look at it in horror like I do. And this is something that again is, you know, kind of makes us ask, like, what's the point of any pretense to international law anymore, and to any kind of normative international regime, all of those pretenses that are now just being shattered.
Yeah, I think the radical left has always been under no illusions that the rules-based order that is so heavily promoted by both right-wing governments and left and liberal governments has always been something of a sham. We've seen over and over again, we've seen violence, we've seen ethnic cleansing, we've seen, the destruction of peoples take place, and lots of kind words are said and resolutions are passed and nothing is done or very little is done. I think the like the really significant difference with what Israel is doing is, at least in part, I think that they, I mean, obviously there's this kind of uh, historic connection, I suppose, which often gives people pause in a kind of additional horror kind of way. But it's also just the fact that this is so fully documented in so many different ways, in ways which really no other. I struggle to think of any other
There isn't
space of
anything like
that
this.
is
No,
covered in the
I
same way.
no. I mean, I think future ones that, you know, may and will probably happen elsewhere in the world will be again. But certainly it's everything is documented.
But and you get to this stage where, like I was watching the International Court of Justice hearings, and the South African speakers were very eloquently saying exactly what was
Yeah.
wrong and what the international community should be doing about it. And then but I had a couple of different tabs open on my computer, and a tab over I was reading the latest report of 15 people had just been bombed to death that very morning. Um, Further reports were coming out. Israel was at that very moment bombing, and you had these two things on the screen at the same time, um, and you could follow both of them along. And it's the sheer level of disconnect between the kind of officialdom's take on what it's supposed to be doing and the kind of the slow roll of justice and all the rest of it, and then just callous, mindless murder. Um, Taking place at exactly the same time. And I think it's very difficult to watch these things and think and still hold any illusions in terms of national governments and their will to carry out their rhetorical.
Responsibility to protect,
Yeah,
civilians. Well, I mean, it's never felt worse to be right. Um, there are still, of course, these continuing efforts, also from, on the grassroots, to at least disrupt and discredit uh, involvement of British industries, of British government, with Israel's arms industry in particular. Um, I think that it may be the case that if more than blocking roads or climbing on roofs of factories, it may be an ICJ ruling that would enable, I don't know if the British government, but that would probably have more effect, at least on the British government that is still pretending to, be part of that rules-based order, be part of that, family of nations, that will pay a lot of lip service to the liberal international way of looking at things. Um, that with whereas countries like Russia and now the US They're just, it's like standing on the springboard in the pool and pissing. They're pissing from the springboard. So that's kind of the difference there. And I think, Israel in many ways, has been a laboratory for how far fascism can get with impunity. It's what it's essentially where it was a sandbox for American fascism. I think that's what it will be seen as if from the distance of another 50 years. It was kind of a sandbox for, well, and for European rise of new European fascism. It was like with arms, so with ideology, so with the um, religiosification of fascism. The making fascism religious more than its modern varieties in the 20th century had been. So it was the sandbox in that sense, and it's just awful and tragic, and it's hard to say much more about it. I mean, and we are sort of feeling restricted to that symbolic action, minor disruption at best. Just like with Lakeheath, and it was a very, yes, photogenic protest and disruption, and it was had its social media exposure. Um, they're allowed to camp and do a peace camp outside, but again, like where is this really taking us? It's very hard to see a way out without a much stronger social base to oppose these things, from the grassroots.
I certainly think, yeah, I mean, in terms of its direct impact, I think something like Lakenheath is necessarily limited because it's going up against well, certainly in the US, a heavily committed government, but against the UK as well, relatively committed, at least in the sense that the UK government doesn't want to piss off the Americans. No, Starmer's government in particular is a government of leverage, in as much as it'll respond to whatever the highest leverage is. Um, it doesn't have an ideology in that sense. And the greatest amount of leverage is quite obviously a desire not to annoy the US government. Um, and that's kind of being balanced against, as you say, its need to um,
Maintain the
at least
rhetoric of
keep a general toehold in the concept of a rules-based order and a connection to the UN and and the ICJ's rulings and all the rest of it. I think there is. I think something like Lakenheath has other elements which are useful in as much as Lakenheath is symbolically for the left. There's a certain totemic element to Lakenheath because it's kind of been the site of peace movements and
feminist
long-term
movements, and
feminist
yeah.
movements and long-term provocation against the state and its military priorities for a long time, and the continuation of that and the commitment to keep that going is it's a showing of ongoing determination from the left, if you like. Or it still exists. We're still out there, and I think that is worthwhile project in and of itself. Um, I don't think it's as directly, direct action is direct action, right? Like the uh, the acts of Palestine Action and Youth Demand both have economic, and particularly Palestine Action's stuff has
I'm not
direct
saying they're not
economic
significant. Of course, they're
ramifications against
significant,
the
and
companies they're going after. But the
absolutely.
but the yeah, like in terms of pressuring the government, obviously, yeah, they're extremely limited in what they can do, and they do, as you say, lack a mass grassroots dimension, which could be truly upsetting the apple cart, if you like.
Well, still, they could be writing letters to their MPs instead, right? They could be
They
standing
could,
around with
sure.
signs on the pavement. So, they're doing it. I think there's a
But
lot to
yeah, and
be
this is
to
the thing,
be
is that like
appreciated and praised about what they're doing.
it's not the fault of the people doing those actions that there is not a strong enough grassroots movement backing them up. Like if there was, then those actions would simply be larger, more disruptive, and more effective as a result. Essentially, what I'm saying there is there should be more people supportive of these movements. That's what that boils down to, I guess. Um,
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting then maybe at this stage to have a little look at the upcoming local elections in Britain because, the way that responses both to atrocities abroad and to the government's, priorities at home, which again are blatantly, leaving the neoliberal status quo, to scramble for what's left, and prioritize military needs over social needs. Um, Still, everybody's sort of in this media frenzy about reform and where will they bite and where won't they bite. I mean, is this a s is I guess it may be skewed by the fact that those who vote in local elections, tend to be the even more dedicated political actors, which may skew that in the direction of, older property owning white majority people. Hence that kind of uh, discussion, right, and anticipation. So, what is your? Are you going to hazard
I,
any
I mean,
predictions
it's prediction. Yeah, I mean
or
predictions.
do any analysis at all?
The obvious one is that Reform are going to do very well. Labour are going to do very badly. It's unclear as to exactly how well the Tories are going to do. I think the Greens will probably do a bit better. I think the Lib Dems could be major. I think they could be a dark horse, big winner. Um,
I mean, have the Lib Dems been trying to criticize Labour from the left on social affairs, or
in places, I think their main draw in local elections has always been we're not the other two. So you can and if they and the clever ones among them tend to leave things relatively fuzzy. So no matter what side of the divide you're on, you can kind of project your hopes and dreams on them. Um, but in terms of kind of the standout thing is obviously the rise of reform going from uh, I can't remember what they had at the election. It wasn't a huge number, but they're up to sort of majority, like the largest party sort of stage in some cases 26, 28% on the upper end, I think. Um, and what that actually means. Uh, I think there is a lot to be said for the fact that it is a local election. I think that there's also the aspect that the overwhelming response to all polling is that people are completely lacking in trust of Labour in general and Keir Starmer in particular. I think Starmer's attempts to say reform are lying to you are both ludicrous and sadly funny, in as much as Keir Starmer is probably the least trusted figure in politics now, having continually broken his word over and over again. It's like you can't then turn around and say, well, reform's led by a grifter. Um,
reform is lying to you? Labour is the real reform.
I mean, I do keep coming back to that picture of him laughing along with Maloney as he asks her opinion on how he should be running the migration system in Britain. It's like just
That's one
astonishing.
just shouting for, like, speech bubbles with all kinds of
Yeah, yeah,
interesting
and it's
content.
just it's this thing of like this. I mean, and again, this without being the whole "we told you so," this is the ratchet effect in action, right? It's um, the Tories screwed
Yeah, but
everything
it's
up
always the
so
social
badly.
democrats who are helping it along. It's not.
But yeah, the Tories screwed it up royally. Labour came in and did basically the same thing on the grounds that, oh well, we need to steal the Tories' shoes. Nobody wanted that. Nobody wanted the Tories' shoes stolen. But they did it anyway, and now an even further right party is taking advantage by saying there's no one to your left, there's no credible left organization that you can be voting for. So all the lefties are stopping voting. So Labour loses its vote. The right moves further to the right. Um, and we're stuck going, yeah, this has happened again, the same as it happened last time and the time before that. Is anyone going to take any lessons from it? I would doubt it. I
Well, I
think,
mean, I think, people are going to have to realize that we are, moving away from democracy. We're moving away from having the civil rights that we are used to taking for granted. We're moving away from a landscape where protest is tolerated, where it's thought of as a legitimate way to even get concessions from government, where, already, of course, strike rights and so on and protest rights are being curbed. So, I think until people kind of think about what we're doing at this stage, which is a historical move away from democracy into more explicitly authoritarian, autocratic forms of rule, um, is the same as, the kind of switch that we need to make when we understand that we're strategizing inside a process of biospheric collapse that is going to last for the next, maybe tens of thousands, or yeah, or hundreds of thousands of years. I mean, when we're talking about the course of evolution has been set for the next millions of years because of the magnitude of the current extinction wave, right? So until we kind of appreciate those realities, then, we'll still keep positing some outdated notions of, you know either inevitable or, yeah, grandiose social change. And I think that those who want to become uh, involved in that kind of endeavor, that, should be doing that from a yeah, I think from a disillusioned perspective, at least about the parts that are illusions. So yeah, so I mean, I guess that's the only kind of takeaway that we can bring from that. Um, we should probably, though, bring it a bit closer to the immediate future at this stage, and yeah, and talk about some other brewings that the Labour government might need to deal with soon. And this is, the public sector pay situation, the government's refusal kind of to promise an increase in pay. I mean, that's been the situation in many sectors, right? I mean, the kind of fall in real wages has been, across the public sector, across, part of the semi-private sectors in the economy for a decade at least. And labor is, again, ideologically signaling that this is where it's going. I mean, surely it can't just be calculating that, the defense money is worth, from its perspective, the loss of public support. Um, they're just blundering, aren't they?
yeah, I mean, yeah, we sort of come back to this a lot in terms of like Rachel Reeves having set herself these kind of arbitrary target that she's um, funneled herself into a situation where she's got no money to spend and therefore needs to find cuts everywhere. And as per usual, the first thing that they look for is cuts to the wage bill, which is the biggest thing on the docket, and therefore the first thing that needs to cut. In this case, they're talking about uh, offering 3.2% pay for council work authority workers, 3% for NHS staff, 2.8% for teachers potentially, all of which is going to come nowhere near. It's not even going to hit inflation, let alone doing the catch up that would that's been built up over the last 10, 20 years. Um, it's
If life was a bit cheaper,
Well, yes, there
if
is
life
also
wasn't
that.
so expensive, I mean, then, but
Mm,
it's that double whammy, right? That's hitting a lot of people so hard.
yeah, and they're doing precious little to pressure energy companies or water companies or to bring those prices down. Their efforts on housing remain completely laughable. Essentially, oh, we'll just build more houses, except that no more houses are even being built, and it doesn't even begin to address the problem of rent gouging in places like London, where it's the problem is less that not enough houses are being built, and more that you've got these immense skyscraper buildings which are all owned by the same giant company. Anyway, people know
Yeah, I
all
mean
this.
that's just not
Uh,
just London. Many big cities, right?
yeah, yeah,
Of course,
absolutely.
we have the same problem in
And
a lot of
that's
city
where the
centers.
jobs are and where people need to be, right?
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, and so they end up with these continual round and round of cutting stuff. It'll be interesting to see what the unions do this time, because obviously, in several cases with the major unions, they are technically funders of labour, um, although it's been very, very rare that they've actively cut funding or let alone ties.
Threatened even to
Yeah.
withdraw. I mean, that's again that same, that same catch with the first past the post system in this country, right? Which affected. I mean, in council elections, it's not the same, of course, but in parliamentary elections, that's what is curbing any sort of strong alternative from the left. And I think that while like electoral politics is always a waste of time, in my opinion, but I think it's particularly a waste of time in two-party dominant systems like the US, like the UK. It's really stuck that way. I mean, with with that sort of symbiosis between the labor movement and or the remnants of the institutionalized labor movement and one of the dominant parties. Uh, yeah, I mean, there are stages where even you're so far from anywhere that even campaigning for electoral reform, it seems like a plausible option. Okay, let's do at least that. um Abolishing nuclear weapons without a revolution, just nuclear. Okay, let's do that.
Well,
it's
yeah.
still it's still quite grim, but I mean, do you think it will come to a head? Is this going to be the first of a series of bumps that is going to accompany labor until it's replaced by a really right-wing government?
So I think there's a good chance that there will be strike action in the summer. I think that they had at least some success taking industrial action last time around. Um, and I think that I mean, the obvious point is that with increasing cost of living, it becomes more pressing for people to take proper action rather than just kind of suck it up. Fundamentally, if you can't afford to live on a job, you can't afford to live on a job. Like this is from the government's perspective, um, possibly more worrying than strike action is the fact that, particularly in the NHS, but also in education and in the local councils, when your pay offers get low enough, people just leave. Um, when it comes to healthcare, nurses and doctors have lots of options. They have options in the US, they have options in Europe. They can get a passport without too much difficulty because they are highly skilled and in demand workers. Um, there is a limit to how far you can drive down those wages before people just start to leave. Um, and in fact, we've already seen it. There's a massive recruitment crisis in the NHS and has been for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, and if people who have, if the caps are removed on higher education fees, then the people who have finished with, medical or nursing degrees are also going to be saddled with increasingly larger student debt, which, this country has only seen the introduction of fees, what, 20 years past, something, no, maybe 25, maybe slightly more. But, it's nothing compared to, countries like Germany or Holland or Denmark, where, the continent where people can study for free. Um, so, saddled with debt and unable to pay back that debt on terms of the jobs offered you here will mean that they will leave. and that's going to again, harm an aging population, harm the most vulnerable and sick. Um, well, more
especially
more
when
of
you have
more of
a
government shooting society in the foot,
yep,
and
not
and
one that
and
reform
and
will fix by by slamming the doors more loudly.
well, let's finish on an optimistic note, because we do have some appointments to meet, and yeah, I guess mope and be grumpy together about the state of the world, or be joyous and creative in our initiatives for local action. And uh, let's have a scan of these upcoming anarchist book fairs with, I guess, the closest one being Middlesbrough. The yes, this is going to be the Teesside Radical Book Fair on May 10th, and I'm not going to move the camera and show you this big suitcase full of books that I'm preparing to take up there. But yeah, I'm looking
Why do those
forward
have
to
to be
seeing
so
people
damn
at
heavy?
Teesside.
That's what I want to know.
Well,
I was at the Cambridge Book Fair on April 27th, which was fabulous. Really enjoyed it. It was a lovely day out. Obviously, great weather helped, but it was actually a really nice thing to see because I had first met the organisers at the Peterborough Book Fair a couple of years prior, and obviously Cambridge struggles somewhat in terms of its anarchist organising or radical organising because it has the university throughput problem where you get a group arises and then 2 years later everyone's left university, gone their separate ways, and the group collapses. In Cambridge's case, absolutely very much hasn't happened, and this is in part because the various of the organising type people are people who just live in Cambridge.
live in the town,
Um,
yeah,
yeah. What was it? The town and gown divide, as it's described in Cambridge, uh, is that if you've got enough people who are town, then you can keep that thing rolling. And it was really interesting chatting to people about how various projects were going on. There was an active Acorn group that's housing defence for people who don't know. There was a food co-op, which is food growing and sort of redistribution co-op going, which is a really great initiative. And yeah, lots of interesting bits and bobs going on. It's also I have to say the number of people who I actually had proper political conversations with was very high, and I would imagine that's at least in part because obviously Cambridge draws in a lot of graduates and such like who are prone to asking questions.
well,
So,
that's quite a nice experience. Yeah, I mean, we'll be also going north for the Newcastle Ewan Brown Anarch- uh, Anarchist Book Fair. That's again, I think, at the same
Star and Shadow.
venue at the Star and Shadow Cinema, which has a lot of space for last time there was a lot of interesting kind of tables there. Um, so those are, yeah, those next appointments. And let's see whether we want to move on to any other topics from the news of the week. We still don't know what happened in Spain with the power cuts. Um, but
Interesting one though.
what was interesting, I think, was how also people reacted. It just turned into it became like a carnival. It was this sort of suspension of the everyday. It was this situation. People were outside, playing ping pong. I mean, the weather helped. I guess
It's also I
small
would
shop
argue
owners distributed water and stuff.
there's an interesting cultural side there. So years and years ago, my brother and I were doing a walk through from France to Spain, and completely by accident walked into a city during a general strike, of which there are, you know, it's not so infrequent there as it is in Britain, shall we say? And everything,
this isn't the general strike where you take over the means of production. It's like a day
yeah,
where
yeah,
there
yeah,
is a general strike, just for
exactly.
our
Um,
yes,
and as a day thing, they're actually quite used to, oh, everything's just shut. We're just going to have a wander around, just kind of take in the scenery, have a nice day off. Um,
yeah. I mean, in parts of in Kurdistan, there's usually a general strike day marking yes the anniversary of the imprisonment of Öcalan. Yeah, that also kind of happens there. So it does, but I think in there it kind of suspended it for large swathes of the country. It was a surprise, and compared to what had happened with all the flooding in Valencia previously, as well as the pressure of the forest fires. It was something quite I think it all resonated there together. I mean, there are lots of videos that people can see on social media of this sort of situation where reality is suspended and there's like possibilities open up for people to do things that are out of the ordinary
yeah, I mean, I think it's
together.
obviously important to like note that uh, disruption of things like hospitals had more serious impacts as well. But one of the
Absolutely.
things which I think is so this comes up a lot. Comes up a lot, I think, in anarchist theory, particularly in the last 5-10 years. To do with COVID and Rhiannon Firth's book on disaster anarchy is this acknowledgement and interest in the ways in which sudden breaks from the norm in the form of crisis, they're presented by the ruling class as a breakdown of society, right? And oh, we've got to get the cops out to defend property, and everyone's going to be looting and killing each other, and it's going to be like the purge, right? Whereas the reality is, in the vast part, and I'm not saying everyone is always lovely, obviously that's not the case, but in large part, what you tend to see in these moments of crisis is people pulling together and helping each other because when you strip away all of the kind of those artificial blocks and
Habits,
the daily and the sort of hour on hour poisoning of our mutual trust, once you strip all that away and you throw
people.
a curveball,
Yeah.
people tend to react as people. And when people just react as people and not as politically influenced actors in that sense, they tend to
They're
behave themselves. They
anarchists.
tend to be much more anarchist than people give them credit for. Um,
I think so too. Well, on this optimistic note, I think we might close tonight's video cast. Thank you very much for joining the Anarchist News Review from Freedom Press. Please follow us. We're on Blue Sky, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're no longer on X, we're on freedompress.org.uk and freedomnews.org.uk. Coming soon.